Okay. Good morning. This is the State Department of Education Special Education Services webinar series on writing an IEP. My name is Angela. My last name is Kwok, K-W-O-K, and we're going to be looking at present levels of performance today. So without further ado, here we go. The session objectives will be defining the present levels of performance, identifying the purpose of a present level of performance in an IEP, looking at specific data sources of what information you want to include in the present levels of performance, content of what information is necessary in that present levels of performance, and several examples. Here we have a cartoon because in special education we are all too familiar with a lot of the acronyms that are used. So this is just a chuckle about an acronym that is used in special education, and it's what's PLAAFP. Well, PLAAFP is understood as the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. And at the bottom you can see a statement that sometimes it's referred to as PLAAFP with the F, or sometimes it's just shortened to present levels of performance. In either aspect, both are just the reference to the same concept of where is the student currently performing. This is a requirement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Every IEP must include a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. That present levels must be current information, and it's specific to how the child's disability affects their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. And then for preschool children, how the disability affects the child's participation in age-appropriate activities. What are present levels of performance? Well, present levels are the foundation of the IEP. It kind of takes the stance of building a strong structure for which the rest of the IEP will be developed. So when you're thinking about, well, is one sentence enough for present levels of performance? Well, I don't know. I mean, is that sentence really has a lot of breadth and depth to it? Or is additional information necessary? So when we're looking at present levels of performance, we're really thinking about the entire picture of the student. And the reason that the word present is in red is because it's so imperative that present means, within, the evaluation information, if it was done 3 years ago, that is relevant information because that full battery may not take place every single year. However, district-wide assessments or benchmarks that are taking place that all students are taking, that typically is done annually, and that information is certainly necessary to paint a picture of where the student is currently progressing. The purpose of the present levels of performance is to provide information to the IEP team so that the team has enough information to generate specific goals, objectives, supports, accommodations, and services that are specifically designed to meet that student's individual needs. The word individual is underlined here because each IEP is specific to that student. The reason that we have a picture of a doctor here is that it's a similar analogy to looking at going to a physician, going to your medical doctor and saying, hey, something's wrong with me. And he looks at you and say, okay, well, what are your symptoms? So that's the same concept of present levels. What are your circumstances of what are you feeling like? What are the known areas of deficit, or what are your strengths? Because that will help us make a determination of how to appropriately intervene. Or in this case, if it's a doctor, they would be providing medication or maybe just some guidance or suggestions. So it's important when you're thinking about present levels to know the areas of needs and strengths so that the rest of the IEP can be developed appropriately. So sources of data. When you're writing present levels of performance, you're like, okay, well, where does this data come from? This data can come from a variety of sources. So let's look through each of the bulleted items specifically. When you're looking at present levels of performance data, it can come from an individual, it can come from group-administered assessments, curriculum-based, and norm-referenced assessments. So any of those are relevant information that could be included with the present levels of performance. It's also good context to know where that current number is in relation to his or her same-aged peers. So if a student is, a 70, well, what is the scale of a 70? Is that average? Is that above average? Is that, in context, is that a C? So it's very helpful to give that reference specific information. State and district assessments can be included in the present levels of performance. If a classroom teacher or other observer has some structured observation notes, that information can be a source of data. We also have a functional behavior assessment as a means of providing additional information for us. Samples of work, so at a high school level it could include a variety of teachers that could include that information. And then student and parent interviews. Sometimes behavior seen at school sometimes is not the same behavior at home. So what is a parent's information on how they view this student's success in the academic setting? Are there struggles? Are there things that work at home that could be implemented in the school to help facilitate that method of engagement? And then factors related to the disability. So if a student has a medical disability and they need additional areas addressed, this present levels of performance could be that area where that information is known. And then finally, transcripts and cumulative records can be a source of data to perhaps include in the present levels of performance. When you're thinking about present levels of performance, it's remembering that picture of a foundation of an IEP. Anyone who reads this very first statement should immediately have a good grasp of what this student may have as far as characteristics. So you're looking at clear, understandable language, because any one person would have a good snapshot of where the student is academically performing, what his areas of needs are, weaknesses, strengths, maybe even the disability category, anything that helps prove what type of needs the student has in order to address his academic areas. It also must be clear, because when you say, well, Sam goes to Mrs. Smith's class 2 hours a day, well, what does Mrs. Smith do? Is she the speech teacher? Is she the learning lab specialist? Is she a reading specialist? So use titles rather than names whenever possible, because it helps clarify in the event that either Mrs. Smith leaves or the student leaves the district. Also spell out acronyms. A lot of times we see GE or SS. GE stands for grade equivalent, and yes, we use that quite frequently, and we also use standard score quite frequently. But unless you're in that language every day, you may not be familiar with those terms. So it's very important that when you use 2.5 and you put GE with it, just go ahead and spell out 2.5, a grade equivalent. And that way they know if it's a 7th grader, that student probably is performing below grade level in reading. Also identify supports and accommodations that may have been used successfully in the past. It's just a good rule of thumb. If something has worked in the past, you don't have to reinvent the wheel to find a new strategy. If it was working and effective before, go ahead and include it in the present levels of performance. So again, that user looking at that information new can know that information up front. Also be specific and use that data to support that present levels, because that's very helpful. You can know immediately where the student is performing, and that's why it's important to do present levels, because if you put 2.5 grade equivalents, but that test was done 4 years ago, well, maybe 4 years ago they were in 2nd grade and they were right on grade level. So it's very important to include the dates and spell out the types of scores. And finally, the last bullet is, without the data, the present levels of performance is only your opinion. So Far too often we've seen Sally Jo Sue is a very sweet girl and makes friends easily. Well, okay, well we know that she is sweet and friendly. However, we don't know where she is performing academically, and we don't know why is she on an IEP and how can we help support her, either with services or accommodations. Content for the present levels of performance can include independent learning levels, student strengths or needs. It can also include preferred methods of delivery, language or effective communication, secondary transition or career preparation, any social skills needs, any adult support needs, whether the student has physical limitations or health concerns that need to be addressed, and also behavior. So what is the present levels of performance? What is it? What's its purpose and what does it do? Well, like we said previously, it gives a snapshot of a child at a particular time and place. So any one person looking at this information can say, oh, okay, I know that Sally needs help in reading and is wanting additional support more than what the general education classroom teacher can see. So I'm looking at this present levels of performance to address exactly where Sally's needs are quickly without having to flip back into the services page or the accommodations. Also, it describes the level at which the child is working academically and functionally, and provides a clear picture of the child's strengths and needs based on evaluation and performance. The present levels of performance identifies and prioritizes the child's specific needs. Sometimes a student has needs that are so great, it's hard to focus on any one area. So present levels of performance can summarize what the greatest area of need is so that it can streamline the entire IEP to address which needs are the greatest and how we're going to work towards those goals first. It also establishes a baseline from where meaningful and measurable goals will derive. So that baseline data lets us know where the student was at any one point in time, and then that way we can see whether growth has occurred or whether the student is plateauing or just staying on the same rate, and then maybe whether we need to address services, supports, or accommodations. So that baseline data is very important because it addresses where the student has gone and where they have to go. Also, it aligns with the entire IEP, including content standards and benchmarks, annual goals, supplementary aids and services, supports, and secondary transition services. This year, more than ever, we are trying to make sure that the word is out there about aligning the IEP, because far too often we're viewing IEPs that whatever is said in a strength or weakness is not the same as the services or the accommodations or goals are addressing. So we're really pushing hard that be conscious about identifying the student's area of need and then having it match all the way through the entire IEP, that whatever the need is being addressed through services, goals, supports, accommodations, and anything else that might be relevant to the initial addressed area of need. So what should the IEP team consider? Well, present levels of performance, again, are present. They're current within the last year. Like we said before, if it's a 3-year evaluation, we're not asking that you do a 3-year evaluation every year, but anytime that general education students have done a screening, that information can be included. State, district-wide results, all of that is data that is collected and can be included in this present levels of performance. It can be in relationship to the district standards and benchmarks in the general education curriculum, or if a student is taking the alternate assessment aligned to alternate standards. Functional areas of concerns related to the child's disability, they may not be reflected in the general education curriculum, but they may be needs that the student needs for independent living or self-care. So those can be included, and those would be self-care skills, social skills, classroom survival, or anything else. When we're looking at an IEP, we all know that we're gaining that information on assessment results to know where the student is currently performing. That evidence allows us to know where the student is currently performing and the level of gap between same age peers. That skill gap is what would be most likely to be addressed in the entire IEP so that that gap can be minimized and diminished over time. The strengths can be addressed so that sometimes whatever is known as an area of strength can be a motivating factor to address the student's area of need. And also the present levels of performance are in relationship to the level of performance that would be required to achieve the goals. Academic achievement and functional performance areas can include parent or student input and concerns, post-secondary interests and preferences if appropriate, academic information, communication information, functional information, general intelligence. You know, if you had a IQ test within the last 3 years, that certainly is helpful information. And then health and medical. Any of that is appropriate to include in the functional areas of performance. You can also consider including motor skills, gross or fine motor, that has to do with mobility, speech or language, sensory processing such as vision or hearing, social and emotional development, behavior, and any other area that needs to be addressed. It's funny because we're thinking about present levels of performance and you're thinking, okay, well, that's a lot of information. Well, it is very specific to each child, and yes, every student has specific needs that can be addressed. And so there isn't one black and white, it must have this information exclusively. It's really dependent upon the IEP team to paint that clear picture of that student. So it would address what the child can and cannot do. Again, results of curriculum-based assessments, including district and statewide assessments and or classroom academic performance with classroom or homework assignments. So again, work samples create a good context of how the student is currently performing. We know that students need to have access to their grade level instruction. However, sometimes students' abilities levels are well below that of the grade level that they're currently performing. So in the present levels of performance, it's appropriate to address how this child's disability impacts his or her involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. In fact, in an IEP, it's required to address to what extent the student will not participate in the general education curriculum. So if there is an area of achievement gap, then this can be included in the present levels of performance. And that's exactly what bulleted number 2 is addressing, is how the student performance is compared to the expectations of their same age peers. Examples of a student's disability impacting their performance in their classroom may be examples of an inability or impaired ability to read, including decoding, comprehension, fluency, maybe even a limitation with writing ability, math calculations, speech deficits, impediments, or even the ability to build or maintain interpersonal relationships. So those social skills, sometimes those need to be explicitly taught instruction rather than just something that they learn. Preschool children, it's also required that the present levels of performance address how the child's disability affects participation in age-appropriate activities and how does the child's level of functioning compare to typically developing peers. So real quick, we have a reading example of present levels of performance of a girl named Sarah. Her strength is that Sarah is able to read first grade literature books independently. Her fluency score is 61 words per minute, slightly under the target of 65 words per minute. She reads common sight words at second grade level. She can blend words with 2- and 3-letter consonant blends as well words with short and long vowel patterns. she's able to apply phonics skills to decode words during structured reading time. So it's a very specific strength. And we can also see a very specific need too. She has an inability to comprehend grade level reading text, which is quite common with a lot of our students. They're having some reading difficulty. And same as all other students, struggles with main idea, answering how and why. And that affects her understanding in other in other academic areas such as social studies and science. And because of her reading comprehension difficulty, she has a hard time contributing to discussions and written assignments. So the impact of her disability is that it impairs her ability to comprehend what she reads and impacts her involvement and progress in general education curriculum. So after reading those strengths and weaknesses, we're looking at the present levels of performance and just addressing, do the descriptions provide enough information to understand where the current student is currently functioning? Is there sufficient information to develop appropriate goals and objectives? And is it clear how the disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum? So these questions, you might want to just kind of take a mental note of this particular slide, because every time you are writing present levels of performance, you're evaluating the quality of your own composition of a present levels. So this slide addresses, some of those key questions of, hey, did I do a good job on my present levels of performance? So these are guiding questions that you can think of too. Did I give enough context for anyone reading this to have enough information to know where the student is currently performing? Finally, we just wanted to leave with some information on our upcoming webinars. We will continue hosting these webinars every other week during lunch break from either 11 to 11:30 or 11:45 to 12:15. And we have several different topics about the IEP that would be addressed. So without further ado, let's go ahead and see if there's any questions that we can help facilitate.
Okay. Let's see if they gave you one, because they can send them straight to you, and not everybody will see it. No new questions yet. We'll give them just a minute.
If you have any questions, you can post them to the chat box and we can discuss any of the questions you have. If not, we just appreciate having you participate in the webinar today. And again, thank you for participating with us on reviewing a component of the IEP called Present Levels of Functional Performance. Thank you.